everybody, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that always gets people talking, affirmative action.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those topics that tends to spark some pretty strong opinions and a lot of debate.
For sure, and we're going to try to get past the usual talking points and really dig into some of the deeper questions, the nuances and ethical dilemmas that don't always get as much attention. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
To help us do that, we've got some really insightful material from the International Debate Education Association.
Oh yeah, they're a fantastic resource.
They do some amazing work promoting critical thinking, and they've really laid out all sides of the affirmative action debate. So
Yeah.
we're going to break it all down for you, so let's just jump right in. Okay?
Yes, do it.
Imagine you're applying for a job or a college spot, and you know that you're not being judged solely on your qualifications. Your race or gender are also part of the equation. That's affirmative action in a nutshell.
Right, and it immediately raises these really fundamental questions about fairness and equality. What does a truly level playing field even look like?
Exactly. And one of the biggest arguments in favor of affirmative action is this idea of correcting past injustices.
Right.
It's about acknowledging that historical discrimination has had real, tangible consequences that can be incredibly difficult to overcome. Like our source uses the example of the systemic discrimination faced by African Americans in the USA, which has limited their access to education and employment for generations. It's almost like they're starting a race miles behind everyone else.
Yeah, and the argument here is that society has an obligation to compensate those who have been systematically disadvantaged. It's not just about saying sorry. It's about taking concrete steps to actually try to level the playing field.
Right. Okay, so that brings us to the second major point in favor of affirmative action, breaking the cycle of disadvantage. Our source highlights this really powerful example from Brazil where poverty is much more widespread in communities descended from slaves, which really shows you how past discrimination can have this ripple effect that impacts economic opportunities for generations.
And what's really interesting here is that this isn't just some abstract concept. There's actual research that shows affirmative action programs, when implemented effectively, can actually help to break that cycle. For example, studies on affirmative action in higher education have found that it not only increases access for underrepresented groups, but it also leads to higher graduation rates and better career outcomes.
Wow, so it's not just about getting people in the door, it's about giving them the support to actually succeed once they're there.
Exactly.
That's a really important point. Okay, now here's a point that I think might surprise some people. Affirmative action has the potential to actually reduce social prejudice.
This is the idea of a demonstration effect, right?
Right.
When people see individuals from marginalized groups succeeding in positions of power, it challenges stereotypes, and it forces people to confront their biases. They start to see individuals, not just categories, and there's research to suggest that this kind of exposure to diversity in leadership can actually reduce prejudice over time.
It's like seeing is believing, right?
Yeah,
It's harder to cling to those prejudices when you're constantly being presented with evidence that contradicts them.
absolutely.
Okay, so we've looked at some of the key arguments in favor of affirmative action, but obviously with any complex issue like this, there are valid points on the other side as well. So let's flip the coin and explore some of those counterarguments.
Sounds good.
One of the biggest critiques of affirmative action gets right to the heart of the issue. Is it really fair to give preferential treatment based on race or gender? Some people argue that it's reverse discrimination and creates injustice in the opposite direction.
Right. This argument really hinges on the principle of meritocracy, the idea that success should be based solely on individual merit. And it raises some really tough questions. Does considering factors like race or gender actually undermine a level playing field? Does it end up penalizing people who might be equally or even more qualified, but just to happen to belong to a designated group?
Yeah, it's a tough balancing act for sure. And that brings up another concern. Could affirmative action actually create negative workplaces for minorities? Imagine getting a job and then constantly facing suspicion that you were only hired because of your race or gender, not because of your actual skills and qualifications. I mean, that could create a really hostile and demoralizing environment, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. And that's a real risk with affirmative action, the possibility that it could backfire and actually reinforce those negative stereotypes instead of dismantling them. Instead of feeling empowered, individuals might feel like they constantly have to prove themselves, which can lead to a lot of added pressure and anxiety.
Right, so it could end up dating the opposite of what it intended. And then there's the argument that affirmative action might actually perpetuate prejudice by fueling resentment among those who feel they've lost opportunities due to these policies.
Right. This argument focuses on the potential for a backlash and the risk that affirmative action could actually deepen divisions in society rather than promote unity. If people believe that the system is rigged against them, it can lead to increased polarization and distrust.
So we've got a lot to unpack here. Affirmative action is clearly a very complex issue with strong arguments on both sides. And as we dig deeper into this debate, we really need to think about the real-world implications of these policies and how they actually play out in different contexts. Now, you might be thinking, hold on a second, isn't affirmative action just about quotas, like filling a certain number of spots based on race or gender? But it's actually a lot more nuanced than that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Affirmative action can take many different forms, from preferential admissions policies to scholarship programs to mentorship initiatives. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach at all.
So let's dive into some of those different approaches. What are some of the ways affirmative action has been implemented in different parts of the world?
Sure. Well, for example, in the U.S., you have court rulings like the landmark Grutter v. Bollinger case, which upheld the use of race as a factor in college admissions, but specifically rejected the use of quotas.
Interesting. So it's more about considering race as one factor among many rather than having these rigid quotas.
Exactly. And then you have examples like Rwanda, which actually has constitutional quotas for women in parliament. This is a very targeted approach that was designed to directly address the historical underrepresentation of women in Rwandan politics.
So it's very much tailored to the specific context and historical circumstances of that country.
Precisely. And another interesting example is Brazil, which enacted a series of policies in 2001 specifically for African descendants. These policies range from university quotas to support for Black-owned businesses.
So it seems like affirmative action policies are really all over the map, with different countries and institutions adopting different approaches based on their own unique circumstances.
That's right, and that's why it's so crucial to consider the historical and social context when we're trying to evaluate the effectiveness and fairness of any affirmative action policy. What might work really well in one country or situation might not be appropriate or effective in another.
That makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like there's no easy answer when it comes to affirmative action. Each situation has its own unique set of challenges and considerations.
Exactly. And it brings up another really important point. What are we ultimately trying to achieve with affirmative action? Is it about representation, creating a more just society, addressing economic disparities? The goals can vary widely, and that can really influence how policies are designed and implemented.
Okay, so how do we even begin to measure the impact of these policies? How do we know if they're actually working? Are they achieving those intended goals? And are there unintended consequences that we need to be aware of?
Those are key questions, and it's not just about collecting data. It's about analyzing that data critically and being willing to adapt our approach based on the evidence. For example, some studies have shown that affirmative action policies in higher education can sometimes lead to a mismatch between students and institutions. In other words, some students who are admitted through affirmative action might struggle academically at more selective schools, leading to higher dropout rates.
That's really interesting. So it's not just about getting people in the door. It's about ensuring that they have the support and resources to actually succeed once they're there.
Exactly. And it highlights the importance of ongoing evaluation and adjustment. We can't just implement affirmative action policies and assume they're working without carefully examining the outcomes.
So it's a dynamic process, not a static solution.
Precisely. And I think this brings us to a question that often gets overlooked in the debate about affirmative action. What about individual responsibility?
Oh, that's an interesting angle. What do you mean by that?
Well, amidst all the discussions about societal structures and policies, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that individuals have a role to play in challenging prejudice and discrimination. Even with affirmative action policies in place, it's crucial for each of us to examine our own biases and actively work towards creating a more inclusive environment.
I see what you're saying. It's not just about changing the system. It's also about changing hearts and minds.
Right. And that means being mindful of our words and actions, speaking up against injustice, and being allies to those who are marginalized. It's about recognizing that we all have a part to play in creating a more just and equitable society.
Okay, so we've talked about the different types of affirmative action, the importance of context and evaluation, and even the role of individual responsibility. It's clear that this is a complex issue with no easy answers. But what I'm really curious about is, how do we measure progress? How do we know if we're moving in the right direction?
That's a great question, and I think it requires us to think critically about what metrics we're using to gauge success. Is it purely about representation? Or is it about outcomes like closing the wage gap or ensuring equal access to opportunities?
I'm starting to realize that there's no single indicator of progress. It's more like a multidimensional puzzle.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial question. When, if ever, should affirmative action policies be phased out? Is there an endpoint, or is this an ongoing process of adaptation and adjustment?
That's a tough one. Ideally, we would reach a point where affirmative action is no longer necessary because systemic inequalities have been eradicated. But is that a realistic goal?
Yeah, I mean, that's the inherent tension at the heart of this whole debate, right? It forces us to really grapple with some fundamental questions about justice and fairness and the very nature of equality. Is it about equal opportunities, equal outcomes, or something in between?
And how do we reconcile the need to address past injustices with the desire to create a truly meritocratic system?
These are questions that philosophers and policymakers have been wrestling with for decades. And while there might not be any easy answers, the ongoing dialogue and debate are essential. We need to continuously evaluate the effectiveness of our policies, be open to different perspectives, and be willing to adjust our approach as needed.
So it's not about finding a perfect solution, but rather about being committed to the ongoing pursuit of justice and equality.
Precisely. And that's a responsibility that we all share regardless of our backgrounds or beliefs. It's about recognizing that creating a truly just and equitable society is an ongoing journey, not a destination.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've explored the arguments for and against affirmative action. We've delved into the ethical dilemmas, and we've even touched upon the role of individual responsibility in creating a more just world. As always, we haven't tried to tell you what to think, but rather to equip you with the knowledge and insights to form your own informed opinions. So as you go about your day, keep pondering these questions. What does a truly just society look like? And what role do we each play in creating it? Until next time, keep diving deep. It feels like we're kind of wrestling with a paradox here, right? We need affirmative action to address inequality, but the ultimate goal is to create a society where it's no longer needed.
Yeah, exactly. That's the inherent tension at the heart of this whole debate. It forces us to grapple with these fundamental questions about justice and fairness and what equality actually means. Is it about equal opportunities, equal outcomes, or something in between?
Right. And how do we balance the need to address past wrongs with the desire to create a system that's based on merit?
Well, these are questions that philosophers and policymakers have been grappling with for decades, and I don't think there are any easy answers. The important thing is that we keep having the conversation. We need to constantly be evaluating how effective our policies are, be open to different perspectives, and be willing to change our approach when necessary.
So it's not about finding the perfect solution. It's more about being committed to constantly working towards justice and equality.
Exactly. And that's something we're all responsible for, regardless of our background or beliefs. It's about recognizing that creating a truly just and equitable society is a journey, not a destination.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into affirmative action. We explored the arguments for and against, delved into some of the ethical dilemmas, and even talked about the role we each play as individuals. As always, we haven't tried to tell you what to think, but rather to give you the information and different perspectives you need to form your own opinions. So as you go about your day, I hope you'll keep thinking about these questions. What does a truly just society look like? And what role do each of us have in making it a reality? Until next time, keep diving deep. It feels like we're wrestling with a paradox here. We need affirmative action to address inequality, but the ultimate goal is to create a society where it's no longer needed.
Yeah, that's the inherent tension at the heart of this whole debate, right? It forces us to really grapple with some fundamental questions about justice and fairness and what equality actually means. Is it about equal opportunities, equal outcomes, or something in between?
Right. And how do we balance the need to address past wrongs with the desire to create a system that's based on merit?
Well, these are questions that philosophers and policymakers have been wrestling with for decades. And I don't think there are any easy answers. The important thing is that we keep having the conversation. We need to constantly be evaluating how effective our policies are, be open to different perspectives, and be willing to change our approach when necessary.
So it's not about finding the perfect solution. It's more about being committed to constantly working towards justice and equality.
Exactly, and that's something we're all responsible for, regardless of our background or beliefs. It's about recognizing that creating a truly just and equitable society is a journey, not a destination.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into affirmative action. We've explored the arguments for and against, delved into some of the ethical dilemmas, and even talked about the role we each play as individuals. As always, we haven't tried to tell you what to think, but rather to give you the information and different perspectives you need to form your own opinions. So, as you go about your day, I hope you'll keep thinking about these questions. What does a truly just society look like? And what role do each of us have in making it a reality? Until next time, keep diving deep.